we will pull a name out of a hat, and there's a grand prize waiting here. We have a great lineup of speakers for this afternoon with topics that will take us gradually from the human mind to the mechanical mind. Our first speaker is Yael Chanin, an associate professor of electrical engineering here at Tel Aviv University and a faculty member of our School of Neuroscience. Yael did her undergraduate studies right here in Tel Aviv. She received her PhD in physics from the Weizmann Institute in Rehovot and went off to do a postdoc at the University of Washington in Seattle. Her research focuses on computational neuroscience and neuroengineering, in particular on engineering artificial neural networks and nano-based neuroelectrodes so as to create an electronic window into the biological mind. Yael is the recipient of a prestigious consolidated grant from the European Research Council and was recently selected to be a member of the Israeli Young Academy of Sciences and Humanities, in addition to being one of the founders of the Global Young Academy, the voice of young scientists around the world. Her motto is, "No man is free who is not master of himself." Yael currently heads Tel Aviv's Research Institute for Nanoscience and Nanotechnology and proposes to challenge our imaginations today with a talk entitled, "How many neurons does it take to change a light bulb?" Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so to remove the suspension, I'm not going to answer the question, but I'm going to try to suggest some things that we're trying in some investigation that we're doing in the lab, trying to address the fundamental question of how a group of neurons interact and whether there's a fundamental level of neuronal modules that can actually do something meaningful. Now, the starting point for this presentation is really the appreciation, and which all of us know very well, that neuroscience relies heavily on model systems. And traditionally, neuroscience has evolved thanks to many models that are representing different levels of complexity on one hand, but on the other hand allowed particular investigation into particular topics. And here is an example of Nobel Prize laureates. Well, the laureates are behind these models, but each one of these models was responsible in a way to the generation of significant know-how in neuroscience. Now, model systems is not just finding the right biological system, the in vivo system that can allow us to do methodic investigation. We can also use computational models. So we can use an actual brain, either the real thing or a slice of a brain, but we can also use computational models. And so these two extremes, computational models and in vivo systems, are the mainstream, basically, of neuronal studies and investigations. There's a niche world which resides somewhere in between these two worlds, and this is the world of in vitro neuronal investigations, where we use neurons, real neurons, okay, so these are not artificial computerized neurons. These are actual neurons that we derived from an animal, often in embryonic stage, and we culture them in a dish, but we use special dish. We use a smart dish that can allow us to do high-level recording at different levels. We can do it electrically, we can do it optically, we can do it in a combined manner, but we can also do it at a single-cell resolution. And probably the most important thing, and this is the core of my presentation, we can also engineer these systems. So we can address specific questions such as whether the morphology of the system or a particular morphology of the system, how does that affect neuronal system? So you can understand that this is something we cannot do with the real thing. The real thing is given, and it's very complex, made of many, many neurons. Here, we choose the system as we wish. We choose how many neurons we want to handle, how they're connected, how they're feed to each other. Here we have a combination. It's a real system that we can hopefully map to the fullest degree. But we can also engineer it to represent a particular specific methodic question. And this is something that as physicists, this is something we like to do. It's very difficult for us just to take a very complex system and try to understand it. We want to control the system, play with some parameters, and ask specific questions. So it looks something like this. These are neurons, in this particular case, using both calcium imaging and electrical recording with electrode that is right here. We can, you see the traces here. You may even hear the cracking sound of the neurons. Of course, they don't make this sound. It's just a representation. And you see that they're within, I mean, you don't see it. I mean, you see that they're live and functional, but you can really appreciate the fact that we can take neurons from an animal. In this particular case, it's rats. Put them on a dish, provide them with the right temperature, right nutrients, and within several days they will be live and normal in the sense that they will communicate with each other electrically and even in a synchronous way. At the same time, you can also run electrical stimulation, and here we're using, again, the electrodes, and we are pulsing the electrode with electrical pulses, and you can see the activation of neurons. You may actually notice, if you look carefully, also the activation of glia waves. So there's a very interesting correspondence between these two populations of cells, neurons and glia, and lots of questions that we can ask. So this is the very basic level. And this has been approached by many researchers over the years, and there's been one big disappointment, which is these systems are somewhat boring. You may call them not so clever, and one of my colleagues referred to them as stupid, because the only thing they appear to manifest is synchronous activity. As you can see here, this is actually the traces of the calcium imaging. So every minute or so, there is big pulse, as you've seen in the calcium image before. Everybody shouts together, and then everybody falls to sleep. And then it's quiet, nothing happens, and then again. So in terms of, if you think about brain activity, this doesn't represent much. It may represent something, but not very interesting. So what can we do? So if instead of using a uniform network, basically a soup of neurons, how about we try to put them into some structure, something that resembles the way they're organized in the brain, and that's using a modular topology. So instead of just a group of interconnected neurons, we now have groups of neurons interconnected together, but now the link between these two groups is not as extensive as the link here. So we have two highly connected networks interconnected in somewhat more defined structure. And of course, you can later move on to more higher and higher hierarchies and work with, say, a modular network. Okay, you do that using neural engineering methods. We actually have such methods, and we can do that. And one of the striking things that you immediately notice is that these systems, when you look at a particular module made of only, say, 50 or 100 neurons, they can actually have oscillations. And you see the oscillations by looking at these repeated bursts, and you see that they're always alike and often represent this very nice feature of strong onset and oscillations. These are not arbitrary frequencies. These are actually frequencies well within the framework of what we're familiar with in brain activity. So it means that already at the level of 50 neurons, you can already establish such an exciting and interesting behavior. Why is it interesting? Well, because when you have oscillations or when you have orchestrated activity, it's very interesting to understand whether there's a conductor, whether there's a photographer, are they talking to each other, where does the synchrony comes from, who's in charge? So these are the questions that we're asking. Also trying, of course, to understand the particular rhythm, where does it come from? Another thing that you can do with these systems is to look at how information propagates from one region to the other. As I've shown you in uniform networks, the activity always is global. When one region is activated, everything is activated. This is almost like an epileptic behavior. In these networks, the activity is gated in the sense that if activity takes place in one place, it may propagate to the next stage only under certain conditions. And you can see it, for example, here we have two clusters interconnected with a bundle of axons and dendrite. this is the activity in this guy, this is the activity in this guy, and each trace here is the actual activity. The color represents, in a way, the amplitude, the strength of the activity, and you see that only when there's strong enough activity here, the activity would propagate over here. So this is one simple mechanism of gating or restricting the activity to a particular pace. You can also demonstrate and go into more details and understand what are the driving forces by playing with the chemistry. By playing with the chemistry, you can play with the different elements that determine how well different elements in the system are connected. And by doing that, you can systematically improve your understanding of which are the different components that play a role. So in particular, in this case, we can compare the control scenario where we have this confined activation compared to the situation where we block inhibition. Okay? So inhibition has a very specific meaning in neuroscience, but you can relate to that in more general terms. But if we use biochemical, we block inhibition, you see suddenly everything works together. So there's no gating. Suddenly the compartments that we had before no longer exist. But the interesting thing and the important thing is that it's not just the inhibition that is very important, but it's really the interplay between the inhibition and the structure. And this is something that we can study only in this particular case when we engineer the system. And I hope now you see the rationale behind what I've tried to present at the beginning, that only by using a system that we have a parameter that we can play with, we can reach and we can address specific questions and specific issues. So to give you an overall view, if we make the comparison between a uniform network and a network that is made of these modular building blocks, we can see that in one system, everything is working always together, all the activity is everywhere. In this particular case, there's very slow and gradual activation. You can see it in a zoom here. Each element activates the next one. Of course, there are conditions when activation propagates and conditions when it doesn't. And then we can go into more and more details of understanding these mechanisms. So graphically, it may look something like this. This is a graphical representation of these modules and the way that they activate and propagate. And you can see in a way how the activity moves about in the system. And a different manifestation of that is when we plot using color coding the extent of similarity between different islands. And you can see how well certain, if you want, memories or certain images are ingrained into the system owing to the development, the way the system has been developed and the way we've been constructing it mechanically. And of course, as I've shown you before, we can use the system and stimulate it, and by doing that, using the combination of stimulation and patterning, we can address higher and higher level of questions related to this field. So just to give you a flavor of additional things that we do in the lab, so I talked about this idea where we can pattern neurons into modules and study how they process information, how they propagate information. We can also use related technologies all under the general idea of neuroengineering, and we can build devices that can actually stimulate neurons as implants. This is a very big effort in my lab, and we're developing such devices hopefully for the purpose of using artificial vision. So as you can imagine, there are a lot of people that have to contribute to something like this. As was mentioned before, my background is in physics, and I've made quite a transition. Some argue that not enough, but I have a lot of people in my lab that provide a lot of additional knowledge, and of course many colleagues that have been very instrumental, and definitely the environment here at Tel Aviv University has proven to be fantastic to build such a project that I don't know how many other places could support. And this is in actual picture the guys, some of the guys that are actually contributing. And so with that I'll conclude, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Chanin, for our most illuminating talk. Our next speaker is Professor Lior Wolf of the School of Computer Science here. Lior did his undergraduate and graduate studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He then did his PhD under the supervision of Amnon Shashua, after which he was a postdoctoral associate in Tommaso Poggio's lab at MIT in Boston. Lior's research focuses on computer vision, that is, on algorithms for understanding images and videos, and on applications of machine learning to vision and to other tasks. He has just recently established a deep learning laboratory here at Tel Aviv, which aims to design nature-inspired artificial neural networks that learn relatively complex representations of objects and of language. Lior and I, during the past few years, have been working hand in hand with scholars in the humanities to apply modern machine learning algorithms to the study of ancient historical documents, such as those found in the Cairo Geniza, among the Dead Sea Scrolls, in Tibetan Buddhist texts, and in many other large collections of manuscripts and texts around the world. Changing light bulbs aside, another thing that humans, and indeed many animals, are remarkably good at is recognizing faces. Lior is a world expert on computer recognition of human faces, the topic of his talk to us now.
Thank you very much, Nachum. Okay, so, 1 second. Okay, so I'm going to speak about face recognition. I'm going to speak about a specific system which is called deep face. Deep face is using a technology which is called deep learning in order to recognize faces as good as humans do. Deep learning is a relatively well-established subject, but in the recent years it has gained a lot of popularity. This year we've established, as Nachum said, the Deep Learning Lab, which is sponsored by Intel, and we already have some interesting projects in face recognition that I'm going to describe today. In action understanding, this one, basically we have input which is a video and we need to tell what's in the video. And also with regards to historical documents, the Nachum mentioned identifying words in documents, reading texts, and processing bilingual texts. So I'm going to speak today about the deep face system, and this is a work done in collaboration with the Facebook AI group. The Facebook AI group is a relatively young group at Facebook. Yaniv, who's been a long collaborator of mine, and several other people are working there together with me on face recognition, and I'm going to describe this joint effort. Why would Facebook be interested in face recognition? Well, Facebook is the #1 biggest collection of images that exists today. Millions and tens of millions of images are being uploaded every day to Facebook. And once images are uploaded, you would like to automatically tag the images and then be able to search for the people in those images. So tagging face recognition is very important for Facebook. And the kind of images that you see in places like Facebook is very much different from the conventional images that we used to have when researching face recognition only 10 years ago. So conventional images are constrained. The classical images that are used in face recognition are constrained, so the resolution is very high, and the pose is very much frontal, very accurately frontal, and the expression and the illumination are both controlled. In the kind of images that you see in web albums and newscasts and other places, you don't control the illumination, you don't control the pose. The resolution can be as low as 50 times 50 pixels, and it's much more challenging to obtain good results. In order to take this very complex problem of face recognition, simplify it, we make some sort of a reduction, and we turn it into a binary problem. So instead of telling who's in the picture, we ask whether two images, this one and this one, or this one and this one, are of the same person. So in this case, we would like to say that this is the same person, although the age is very much different, the pose is different, there is occlusion, the expression is different, the illumination is different, everything is different. but the identity is the same. So we would like to tell this is the same person. In this case, the expression is similar, the illumination is similar, but it's a different person. We would like to tell that it's a different person. And we've been studying this kind of systems for many years now, maybe 6 or 7 years now. And there's been a lot of competition. This is a very competitive field. And you can see in this graph, this is basically false positive rate, true positive rate. You want to be as high as here. And you can see the progress that really occurred in the last 5 years. People came up with better and better systems. It was pretty hard to keep on competing in this benchmark. But ultimately, the goal is to get up here. So this is human level of performance. We would like to get a system which is as good as humans in the task of face recognition. If we consider the conventional face recognition pipeline, you get an image. So you detect the face in the image, then you align the face, you make it frontal, then you represent the face as a vector, and lastly, you classify the vector that you obtain as one of the faces that you have in the database. So in order to get state-of-the-art performance, we had to make changes in all of these 3 components. With regards to alignment, we noticed that faces are 3D objects, so we need to treat them as 3D objects. I'm not going to get into too much of the details. I'm just going to say that if this is the face as detected, the square is the detected face, a conventional system like the one that we used for many years, this is what it would give you. It would just align the image in 2D, would improve some of the situation, but not get rid of all of the pose influence. And this is the system, this is the view that we get using 3D alignment. We get a truly frontal view of the face. We can actually get any other view as well, but for face recognition, as the technology stands now, this frontal view is the best view that you can use. Once we have an aligned face, so this is the original face, this is the aligned face, we just take the RGB values of the face, just the raw input. There isn't any pre-processing done to the image. Very neatly, we just pass the image to a neural network with a lot of layers. So this is actually the neural network that we use. The input is the image, just the RGB values of the image. The output over here is the representation. So we take the image, we pass it through many layers of convolution, maximization, then local filters. This is quite technical. At the end, we get to a vector. The vector has a size of 4,000. This vector is trained on a separate database in order to teach it to recognize one of 4,000 persons. So we have a separate data set that we use just for this purpose of training this neural network. It has 4 million images and 4,000 faces. It's called the Social Face Collection, and it's a very unique collection because it doesn't have too many persons inside. It only has about 1,000 individuals, but each one of these individuals has many images. And in this regard, the database is unique. These are all the images of just one person. You can see that we can actually train the system to deal with a lot of variability, all the variability that exists for one particular person. Once we get this black box, this neural network, deep neural network that transforms the input image into a vector, we take the image, we turn it into a vector, we take the other image, we turn it into a vector. We then combine these 2 vectors together using a Siamese network. I will explain in the next slide. And then we provide a decision whether it's the same person or not the same person. So what's the Siamese network? Siamese network is just taking 2 neural networks, this one and this one, clumping them together to obtain one combined network. This combined network, given 2 images, one comes from here, the other one comes from here, is able to provide the decision whether the images are of the same person or not the same person. And if we go back to the kind of graphs that we use in order to judge the results, the black line that you see over here is human level of performance. The red line that you see is the result of our system, which you can see tracks very well the human performance. And the results are pretty astonishing. If you look at what we used to get a few years ago in facial cognition, some of the results were just embarrassing to look at. But now you can, even when the system makes a mistake, you can try to understand what's going on. So in the red region, you see all the cases where the mistake is caused by age difference. And in green, you can see all the places where there are sunglasses, which is challenging for facial cognition. Blue are the places in which there is a lot of occlusion and so on. You can understand when a system fails, you can try to make excuses for it. It's no longer embarrassing to look at the mistakes. And those are the false positive results. The system thinks those are the same person, but they are not. Sometimes you can understand why this mistake is made. So this was about facial cognition in stills images. We are given just an image. We want to recognize the face. We get very good results. How about if we want to recognize from a video sequence? So for this purpose, we collected a very large collection of movies from YouTube with face sequences, and we ran basically the same type of experiments. And the same system that we described before, without much modification, is able to make a huge leap over the existing state of the art and provide much, much better performance than before. So we've already established that the system is pretty accurate, more accurate than any other system in existence, but there are other nice properties that the system has. First property is that the representation is compact. So as I said before, facial cognition is a very competitive field. Throughout the years, people just moved from hundreds of features to thousands, to tens of thousands, to hundreds of thousands of features, trying to get better and better in facial cognition. The representation that we use in deep face is about the same size that we used back in 2009. So it's much more compact. We're able to store many more representations on the device, make the queries much more efficient. In addition, and this is a very nice surprise that stems from the architecture of the system, but not something that we designed to get, the representation is also sparse. Out of this vector of 4,000 numbers that we use in order to represent a single face image, 80% of these numbers are just zero. So a face is represented actually by a very compact, very sparse set of numbers, a very compact signature that we can store very efficiently and describes the face in some high-level fashion that we are able to interpret and understand what's going on beyond the system. So this is what I prepared for today. We've seen just one example of a deep learning system where a deep network of many layers is used to represent faces. We get an additional boost in performance by using very accurate 3D alignment, and the training of this neural network is based on a very unique data set of 4 million face images. Lastly, in order to make the actual decision, we combined multiple networks together in order to obtain one score. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lior, for a deep glimpse into the digital mind. Natan Intrator received his PhD in applied mathematics from Brown University and stayed on there for a postdoc. He's professor of computer science and of neuroscience here, and has been studying computational models of learning and of memory. Currently, he develops machine learning and signal processing for advanced brain imaging and brain-computer interaction. He is co-author of the book Theory of Cortical Plasticity, and he will share his thoughts on brain-inspired computation in this 21st century with us.
Hello, everyone. So as you all know, we are actually celebrating Professor Marvin's Minsky Prize, the David Prize. And I thought that I'll present a talk not about my research, but in honor of Professor Minsky, who has been active for over 60 years, and take you through a science roller coaster of the scientific events that Marvin has been part of and has happened in this possibly one of the most amazing times in science. Professor Minsky is connecting between machine learning and neuroscience. I'm kind of going in the same direction, and so I think it would be kind of interesting to show those similarities. So we are going to talk about the future, but we really have to go back into the past, and I want you to try and imagine that you are now in the 1920s, and this Enigma machine has been just commercialized. This Enigma machine was actually one of the first cryptographic machines that the Germans invented. At that time, it did not pose a serious threat to other militaries, and nobody paid too much attention to it. However, in World War II, the Germans have upgraded this machine quite a bit, and it became a big issue for the British fleet that was trying to get close to Germany, as the German submarines were actually getting close to the fleet and being able to drown a lot of boats. So in a kind of circumstantial, maybe luck set of events, just before Poland fell and was acquired by Germany, they were able to get wiring information of the latest Enigma machine. And that happened in the middle of 1939. This information was then transferred to England, and a group of young scientists started working very hard trying to find a way to solve the problem. So that was a cryptographic system. There were a lot of possibilities, but nothing like the cryptographic systems we use today. And the hope of Alan Turing was to try and build a computer that will be able to crack this code. So in early 1942, after 1.5 very intense years of effort by a large group of British scientists, Alan Turing actually introduced this computer. This is actually the first digital computer. And this computer is possibly one of the single reasons, the main reasons why the Germans were defeated in the war. That was said by Churchill. And unfortunately, as you probably know, Alan Turing did not get recognition, not for this computer that he created, and not for the fact that he actually helped the British and the whole world to defeat the Germans in World War II. That was for a different reason. I'm not going to go into this. Just very few years ago, actually, the Queen of England and all of England pardoned and requested his forgiveness. Alan Turing actually committed suicide at a very young age in the 50s for being prosecuted by the British people. So this is the first digital computer, 1942. In 1945, as Professor Minsky mentioned in his talk on Sunday, there was a group of the best scientists in the world that were convening in the other side of the ocean in the US, trying again to defeat the Germans and create the atomic bomb and whatnot. And as part of that, in 1945, von Neumann presented the first principles of the modern computer, which again were quite similar to what Alan Turing presented a few years before, but this is considered the beginning of the digital computer era. And in the same decade, which was probably the most amazing decade of that century, Shannon in 1948 presented the foundations of information theory. This is really the foundation of all the communication that is happening today, cryptography and computer codes of all sorts. And at the same time, Donald Hebb presented what is called the Hebb rule. So the Hebb rule is connecting between what's called the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron, and indicating how the synaptic weight is changing for each neuron in our brain, in mammalian brains, and in every neuronal system. That rule, which kind of can be summarized here in a very simple way, cells that fire together wire together, meaning that if the presynaptic and postsynaptic neuron are active at the same time, the synapse, the connection between them, is actually getting stronger. Very simple rule, still a reason for a Nobel Prize. And it turned out that this rule was too simple and did not do the job. And we will get back to this because 60 years later, we still don't have the right rule. So we'll have to go back to this a little later. Marvin Minsky just finished his bachelor's and started his PhD at Princeton University. I believe he was deeply influenced by Donald Hebb's discovery, and he built the first learning machine. So this is really the first learning machine. We had the first computer with 2 people, but this is the first machine that could learn in real time, online, modify its weight or modify its ability to analyze data as a result of the data that it was receiving. That was the SNARC, Stochastic Neural Analog Reinforcement Calculator, that was built in the beginning of Marvin Minsky's PhD. It took another 20 years before that, let's go to another amazing event, 1953, the beginning of 1953, IEEE signal processing, transactions on signal processing started its circulation. If you read the first journal of that, of IEEE, it appears to have most of the signal processing that is still active today, in particular in radar and what later became sonar. I'm mentioning it here because we'll go back to it a little bit later. So we are going now to 20 years after Marvin Minsky presented his learning machine, and he presented this book with Pappert. Minsky and Pappert presented this book called Perceptrons, where they laid out the theory very nicely, added some mathematical proofs, and were able to show that this learning rule actually converges and is actually a nice rule. So it looks like things should have become very good, correct? Unfortunately not. Maybe the book was too simple and was too many people could read the book. And one person realized that if he combines the information coming from von Neumann's computer and the perceptron, there's a little glitch, there's a little problem, and that was the XOR functional, or the XOR function. I'm not going to get into it too much. Just say that this is one binary function that the computer has to produce, has nothing to do with the brain. The brain has never heard about it, but this whole theory was put into rest for about 20 years because of this XOR. Is that correct? 20 years because of one XOR. Okay, so one pathology actually slowed down the progress of science for 20 years. It took a giant like Jeff Hinton 20 years later to actually revive this theory. So a group of scientists at the beginning of the 1980s convened in UC San Diego, and out of that came what's called the error backpropagation algorithm, which basically added another layer onto the learning layer of the perceptron that was presented in 1951. Okay? There was a lot of excitement around this backpropagation, what's called the backpropagation rule, and it was believed that this will solve all the problems in the world on the computational side, and is very nicely brain-inspired and will definitely develop and enhance our understanding about the brain. That did not happen. After a few years of excitement, people realized that actually it is not an algorithm that is better or more efficient or anything else with comparison to other methods like regression or logistic regression, which the statisticians were advocating, or slightly later, all sorts of kernel methods which were used as learning machines. But the science of learning machines has definitely developed quite a bit. It took another almost 20 years for Jeff Hinton to come back with an improvement of that error backpropagation algorithm. He believed in it all the time and was looking for ways to really make it work well. And this is the deep belief network. In this case, he added a few more layers to the backpropagation and presented actually a very efficient algorithm to learn or to adapt the weights in this deep network, which was termed deep belief networks. Deep belief network and deep everything. So we just heard the talk by Yoav, who is using this deep network. And definitely this became a very big hit. So there's even a happy end here. And Jeff, with a company that he formed around this, was acquired by Google in 2013 after demonstrating that he could reduce a significant amount of the error in speech recognition. So speech recognition, which was always done by engineers and had was based on signal processing and understanding speech production, was stalled for about 20 years, and error or the performance did not improve. Jeff was able to demonstrate that with a lot of data and with a sophisticated algorithm, he could chop off a significant amount of error in this algorithm. So we just went through a roller coaster, a scientific roller coaster, where we went back and forth in our performance and in our ability to move science ahead. Obviously, those days just after World War II were amazing, but then things went sometimes slow and too slow. In one area, things were consistently improving, and this is computational power, speed, and memory. So there's no doubt that in a consistent, very consistent way, since von Neumann presented his first computer, or Alan Turing presented his first computer, we've been seeing an amazing exponential improvement, and we want to take advantage of this. I'm putting here the Altera, which is a new architecture, what's called the FPGA, Field Programmable Gate Array, which is a hardware that is actually modified by software and can actually be modified after each cycle of computation. It's a very powerful hardware. This, in my mind, is the closest hardware that could mimic in the future brain activity, and it is also becoming very powerful for solving regular problems. Let's go back to the problem that I started with, this Heb rule. So this Heb rule, okay, you can see it. This Heb rule, here we are about 50 years after the Heb rule was presented. And it was reasonable to expect that, after a huge number of animals were sacrificed, a lot of experiments were performed on various animals, from the aplysia to monkeys, that we would resolve this synaptic modification rule. In 2000, we realized that actually we are still far from that. And with my mentor, Professor Leon Cooper, who got his Nobel Prize for his PhD thesis in physics and was deeply involved in all of the physics of this millennium, the 20th century, we wanted to present what was known and to study what should be improved. We took the approach of another Nobel winner, which is to simplify the problem as much as possible, but obviously not too more. And we tried to look at the rules, the main rules that were still kind of active at the end of those 50 years, and compare them and see what are the implications, what are the mathematical implications, what are the information and statistical implications of these rules, to try and eliminate some and maybe support others. We've done that in this book, and unfortunately we have not closed the problem. This problem is still not resolved at all. Another approach is now being taken by the Human Brain Project, and here the idea is not to simplify but to go to the other extreme, to try and use massive number of computers, massive amount of computation, and to try and model the cell in the most complex sequence of events that are happening in the cell, with the hope that by this very tedious modeling of the cell, the learning rule will pop out and will become evident. And the idea is to sacrifice computer time instead of animals, and to massively try various algorithms in order to resolve this problem. Henry Markram, who's here in the picture, is promising us that they will solve the problem in the next 10 years, and let's just hope that this will happen. I want to finish with a couple of open issues that, in my mind, have not been dealt sufficiently in the last 60 years. So I talked about the synaptic modification, and I presented various approaches to try and resolve that. There's one fundamental problem that has not really been looked at, and this is the data representation in the brain. It is my belief that the brain of mammals can form a data representation in a very complex way, but in a way that leaves the data to be very simple and to be amenable to very simple computations. So what do I mean by this? I mean that the brain learns how to represent data in a totally different way that we are trying now, either in our computational studies or when we try to mimic the brain. And in this representation, very complicated problems become very, very simple. I don't see any other possibility, because if I look at this sonar bat, and I apologize for those who heard me say that a few times, this sonar bat has very few neurons, actually smaller than the number of transistors in a Pentium. The energy consumption of this sonar bat is few millworms a day, so it's like zero. And the problems that this sonar bat is solving in real time, we cannot solve now. We cannot get to that accuracy, even if we take a huge, deep belief network connected to an energy power station. So the only, as the computation in the sonar brain of the bat is simple, the only other possibility is representation. If we could mimic the data representation that the dolphin has, and solve and build a sonar with the resolution that the dolphin has, we could eliminate the need of CT, PET, MRI, and other big machines, because the ultrasound or sonar of the dolphin is over 100 times better than what we can do today. I include here the elephant, which a lot of people do not know, but the elephant has seismic sensors in his legs and is able to detect and predict earthquake much better than our algorithms can do. So these two animals are actually posing a very strong challenge to our signal processing technology, that signal processing that exists in the last 60 years and still is very far from the abilities of these animals. And to end in a somewhat positive note, these computers, which, as I mentioned, did improve dramatically and very consistently are now in a position where they can really pose kind of a threat to whatever we feel we know or whatever we feel we can do with our brains. So these computers can beat us in chess and can beat us in Jeopardy and whatnot. And my hope is that they will be used to maybe beat us or at least add to our innovations in trying to understand the brain and maybe help us not just to understand the brain but help the failing brain. As we heard this morning, that dementia is such a huge problem, and the number of people with dementia is growing so rapidly. We hope that those computers can help in that as well. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Natan, for an exhilarating ride through these past 7 heady decades of learning more and more about digital learning. I invite Professor Amiram Yudai of the School of Computer Science to introduce our Dan David Laureate of the Future Dimension.
Thank you. It is an honor for me to introduce Marvin Minsky, Professor of Media Art and Sciences and Professor of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at MIT. Professor Minsky is known as one of the founders of artificial intelligence, but this does not really capture fully his contributions. His work has been influential because it was so visionary. His books, for example, Perceptrons, that was mentioned here in 1969, Society of the Mind in 1985, and The Emotion Machine in 2006, received a great deal of attention and sometimes controversy. With the depth and width of his contribution, a more fitting characterization is that Professor Minsky is really one of the most influential intellectuals of the 20th century. Aside from his many inventions and contributions, too numerous to list, and we've heard a little bit by Natan earlier, an example of his impact beyond the realm of science is that he was an advisor on the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. Marvin Minsky received a BA degree from Harvard, a PhD from Princeton, both in mathematics, and has been a faculty member in MIT since 1958. Professor Minsky was recognized with numerous prizes and awards. I will only mention that he was one of the earliest recipients of the Turing Award, and of course, this year he received the Dan David Prize in the Future Dimension in the field of artificial intelligence and the digital mind. Please join me in welcoming Professor Minsky to deliver his presentation.
I did something to my ankle. I don't know what caused it recently, and it occurs to me while walking up the stairs that the greatest invention of all was the stick. Computers are good, but the stick is really quite versatile. I've been looking at the slide on a little computer, and it seems much more important when it's 18 feet square. Well, I was very lucky to mature at a strange moment in history. I mean, all moments are unique, but the analog computer had developed in the early part of the 20th century. And when I got to be an assistant professor at MIT around 1960, most of the professors were specialists in analog computers, which were dying out. And the people who knew about digital computers were the students of the, for example, the MIT Model Railroad Club, who had built little digital simulators of the New York subway system because their main activity was to see who could calculate a trip that would go to every subway stop in New York in the least time. And there was an annual... Anyway, I was in a lucky position where I knew a bit about both digital and analog systems, but it was clear that the future was digital, and most of the faculty was analog. And so I got a reputation for inventing all sorts of wonderful things, but this was largely due to my accumulating the best students for a period of 10 to 20 years in the environment of the analog community that was dying out and the digital community that was growing. So anyway, of course, as you all know, computers were and still are mainly used for rather specialized purposes, but there have always been some people who envisioned trying to get computers to do not just very logical and precise mathematical types of calculations, but also to do more commonsensical, everyday, human cognition-like activities, and a lot of the wonderful things that people attribute to me having accomplished came from, along with Nicholas Negroponte and maybe 5 or 10 other younger professors at that time, accumulating the more imaginative students, and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so some of us were more interested in trying to make commonsensical calculations than technical calculations, and that's what I'll talk about for a little while, and then hope that some of you have questions. I wonder how you change the page on this thing. What would be a good key to press? Oh, that's a nice one. It's wonderful. Well, humanity faces lots of terrible problems. It's used to facing terrible problems for many centuries. The world population of humans has been decimated by waves of new diseases, new ones and old ones. We're on the threshold of being wiped out by yet new and more wonderful diseases, many of which will be invented by young high school students who say, I wonder what would happen if I made a virus that had some of the property, or a bacillus, some of the properties of typhoid and scarlet fever and polio and maybe a few hundred genetic bases, and put them in a string. Wouldn't it be fun to see what the doctors do about, oh well, you know, it's going to be a problem. We worry about terrorists inventing new diseases and so forth, but I think we had better worry more about high school and precocious grade school synthesizers of things. Anyway, we're facing a lot of difficult problems today, and they're about to get worse. If they don't, then we face another set of problems, because people in the developed countries 100 years ago were old if they lived to be 50, and now it's not really very rare for people to live to be 100. What was the name of that lady who was 120? Jean Calment. She was, shortly before her recent death, she gave an interview in which she mentioned that she had met my voice dying out. Well, I'm rambling. Anyway, she lived to be about 120. And I think she holds the current record. We still need people to do work, and that's because robots have not gotten very skillful yet. They've been developing much more slowly than I expected them to. When we had our first robot in 1960, my lab built a robot which was a one-armed, well, basically it was just one arm and a head with an eye or two. But the arm was very nice. It had 4 elbows, or rather 3 elbows and a shoulder, and it could reach around and pick somebody up. And the trouble with the human arm is that it can't really get around very well, and in order to do something over here, I'd have to walk around. But this arm with 3.5 elbows and a rotating shoulder could do all sorts of wonderful things, including picking people up without moving its body, which was convenient because it didn't have a body. And that was around 1960, between somewhere halfway between 50 and 60. And I don't understand what happened then. Namely, nothing. No robot arm you can buy today has anything even approaching the capability of that arm. It's in the MIT Museum waving around, and the movies of it have been distributed, and nevertheless, it hasn't inspired any. Oh, well, I'm rambling again. I think if we, pretty soon, we'll have more versatile robots. I always think we'll see them next year. Anyway, when they turn up, there'll be a revolution because, as in this image here, once you've got 2 or 3 or more potentially versatile robots, then you should be able to program them, some of them to repair the others. And this is a little fantasy of 3 robots on the moon. I think it's 3, yeah. 2 of them are fixing a 3rd one. And of course, up to now, whenever we put something on the moon, except for people, there's only one of it. And so, or on Mars, there's usually, right now there are 2 robots that can move, but I don't think they're anywhere near each other. So you couldn't call one to fix the other. People should be a little bit more bold, I think. How do you make a machine that can understand what it's looking at? Well, one can try and make a unified theory of vision and pattern matching and so forth. And you just saw an example of where a group of researchers wanted to make a machine recognize faces, and that was a 30-year project, actually, not theirs, but people have been trying to do that for at least 3 or 4 decades. And it looks like it's finally happened in the sense that the current generation of face recognizing machines are better at recognizing faces than humans are. We had a crude prototype in the Nicholas Negroponte's architecture group at MIT, had a face recognizer which was actually better than people for a certain restricted range of postures and expressions. And it was pretty wonderful because if you called it up, it could tell whether you were smiling from the way you talked, so that it was, in a sense, recognizing your face without even seeing it, which is slightly better than telling whether you're smiling by looking at you. Anyway, it isn't time to discuss all what's in the slides I'm going to bewilder you with. But here's an example of 12 aspects of what a visual system could do. And over the years, people have made computer vision systems that combine gradients and knowledge and about geometry and stereo convergence and so many other different aspects of normal and vision under difficult conditions, that machines are really about ready to see better than humans can. Nobody's really, well, it's an interesting point of history, and it should be very exciting to see what capabilities come out of artificial intelligence and related areas in the next dozen years. It's been very hard to predict what will happen in computer science. what some problems that people thought computers could never deal with turned out to be easy, and other problems that nobody worked on because they seemed too easy are still unsolved. And it's a wonderful field to be in. Every year we're full of surprises from of things happening that no one expected. And the worst surprises are when you don't find progress in some obvious area of computer science which you expected to be to progress uniformly. Most of the progress in computer science has come from intellectual viewpoints being developed that some of which were thousands of years old. I found this description somewhere in Aristotle. One person might describe a house as a shelter against destruction by wind, rain, and heat. Another might describe it as a structure made of stones, bricks, and timber. A third description, the good one, would say it was that form in those materials with such and such a purpose or in mind by the person who had constructed it. So the idea of a goal has become concrete in computer science. The very idea of cybernetics. Do you know that word? That cybernetics is the form of artificial intelligence that developed in the 1940s and early 1950s. Just the idea that a machine could have a purpose seemed wonderful and weird and surprising when I was a child. It just came out. Some of it was very well recognized in the science fiction of Campbell and Asimov and people like that, and it crept into the sciences and became, by the 1950s, was a standard vocabulary of engineering. Feynman. Every physicist knows 6 or 7 different ways, representations for exactly the same physics. He knows that they are, he or she, it should be, are all equivalent, and that no one is ever going to be able to decide which one is right at that level. So the physicist keeps them all in mind at once, hoping that some of them will give different ideas for the next, and so on. I'm not quoting Feynman literally, but and I had the fortune to, I didn't know Aristotle, but I met Feynman when I was very young, and I wanted to be like him, and in some ways I made it, and most I didn't. Thinking back, I can't remember him ever being wrong, and I can remember me being wrong a lot. So here's a dozen ways of representing things. You can find this in this diagram in a couple of my recent books. I have about 3 books about the future of engineering and artificial intelligence and so forth. And it doesn't matter which one you read. The book called The Society of Mind is maybe the best one for beginners because all of its chapters are exactly 1 page long. And if you skip one, it won't hurt. The big book called The Emotion Machine has 9 chapters, And if you skip one, the others won't make any sense. So don't read it. If you do read it, though, you'll be a new person and you won't recognize yourself anymore. Anyway, if you have 2 or more robots, that's all you need if they know enough about how to repair each other. Soon people will live 200 years. Then we'd better average less than 1 child per adult, or the earth will become intolerably crowded. So I don't know what to conclude. Am I going backwards? How nice. It's too bad we can't go backwards in real life. There's Aristotle. There's a list of 7 different aspects of artificial intelligence. And if you're interested in science and the future and stuff like that, drop whatever you're reading and catch up on the progress of artificial intelligence, because that's going to be the most important, obviously, most important subject in the future. As soon as the machines get smarter than people, then you won't have to listen to people anymore. So we're living in a strange time. Skip a few of these things. My thinking turned out to be based on some of Freud's thinking. Freud was actually the first person I know of who started to make theories of how thinking could result from computations done by nerve cells. He non-published a paper in 1880, I'm falling over myself. I think it was 1889. He wrote a long paper which was a theory of neural networks and how they could do various kinds of reasoning. And no one would publish it because it was so science fiction-y and weird. It was finally published in 1950. That's 60 years after Freud wrote the thing down. And it had this early Freudian idea of superego, ego, and id, namely that the brain might work in 3 layers. So that part got accepted for other Freud publications, and that was the foundation of psychoanalysis. But the main thing about his project for a scientific psychology paper that wasn't published for 60 years was that it proposed how neural nets could do learning, and the synapses would be important, and blah, blah, blah. And it looked like something that otherwise would have appeared around 1930 or 40. I don't know why. I think Freud was so discouraged by being unable to publish that stuff that he switched entirely to. And none of his later writings tried to make up mechanistic theories of how the mind works. So it's an interesting fragment of history that he had pioneered artificial intelligence in a way, but gave up on it. I think of the brain in terms of, as I think many theorists do nowadays, that the brain is a cloud of little processes, or the mind is, and the tiny processes that are combined to make larger ones are not understood yet very well. We don't know much about what's happening, and the states of mind or the mental activities that we have names for, like hunger, anger, fear, thirst, each of those represents the activity of various parts of the brain and arranged in different configurations. And to develop a theory of psychology that's physiologically sound, eventually we have to get more good ideas about the subparts of the brain and how they switch on and off. I have a grim and depressing view of the well-known effort to get 60,000 people to look at slices of the brain and type in their impression of where the wires go. What's it called? The Blue Brain Project? There are a couple of projects, maybe 3 or 4, around the Earth, have managed to soak up a huge amount of money to get thousands of people to look at microscope slides and type in information about how the nerve cells are connected to each other. And I suspect that all of this money will be wasted because they don't have the people transcribing these pictures haven't been given the right instructions about what patterns to recognize and type. And what has to be done is you should start with something like a dragonfly or a flea or a worm or something like that, and make sure that you know enough about its nervous system to get a simulation that behaves the way the worm does. Spend a couple of years doing that and do a dragonfly and work your way up to, I was going to say a mouse, but that maybe should be even further off. And then once you've got the complete diagram of a nervous system of a very, very small animal, and have spent only $50 million and written computer programs that look at the microscope slides and trace the connections, then you can start on something larger like a tiny mammal like a mouse. So I think when you read announcements about these massive projects to get 10,000 people to type in what they see on their microscope slide of a piece of a brain, I think rather than say, ooh, that's great, you should groan and say, that's a waste of money that has prevented 100 really good projects to more thoroughly understand a simpler animal before you start spending hundreds of millions of dollars on getting this unproved technique on the road. So grumble, grumble. I don't know what to do. There are lots of things. Psychology today is one of the most active, rapidly growing sciences of all time. If you have a good idea, you can, I hope you can find someone to support your being able to spend a couple of years or more developing it. There's a little kink in history that might make that difficult. I was very lucky because in the 1950s, when I finished college and started to work on the nervous system or make theories of it, there was a naval officer who was the grandson of the physicist who taught Einstein tensor calculus, which is what he needed to make general relativity. And anyway, there was a little branch of the Navy which was secret, and it had been spending several years near the end of World War II rescuing scientists from Europe and shipping them to places like Harvard and MIT, and especially Princeton, and even the Institute for Advanced Study. And that branch of the Navy, which never had a name, latched on to some research projects, perhaps because of the great scientists' influence who they had rescued. And so I happened to be in that flow of things, and anytime I wanted something, I'd mention that to one of these naval officers, and a bunch of money would appear, including my own tuition, actually. And every time we wanted to do something, this pile of money would suddenly appear, and this went on for a long time. So that when a student came along and proposed something that might take 4 or 5 years, and we liked it, we'd say, well, okay, try it. And that went on till about 1975 or 80. And then the funny thing happened where things were Republican up to then, and then there was a liberal change in the government, and Democrats and liberals took over, and they said, ooh, the military shouldn't be doing that kind of basic research. That's something that should be under the influence of civilians, because, you know, military people are bad. And guess what happened? The whole thing disappeared, and now if you want to do some research, you could get funding for a whole year, maybe. And so people would propose projects that they thought they might be able to get done in a whole year. And the quality of American research in this area of artificial intelligence and future of computers and so forth practically disappeared overnight. And it was funny, paradoxically, because one stereotype was that the liberals would be better at looking at the different possibilities of the future than the reactionaries. But because of these funny quirks in history, it turned out almost the opposite. And under the liberal government, rather than reactionary, fascist, whatever you want to call it, the research community became very pinched and restricted. Well, I could talk forever. Who has a question? Thank you. There's one, I think. In my class, half the students have a question. Yep.
No. Yeah. Thank you, Professor Minsky, for your
Thank you.
thought-provoking thoughts and predictions. Well, we've all gathered here today at this symposium to hear the latest in human understanding about the most complex of natural biological machines, the mind, and about one of the mind's greatest intellectual challenges, the creation of a digital mechanical mind. If the Greek thinkers defined the human race as those animals that think, then the study of thought, of mind, and of memory is the study of what it is that makes a woman or a man human. How does the brain remember what it experiences? We heard from laureate Brenda Milner on the mechanisms of memory in the human brain. We look forward to greater and greater insights into memory and mind from her protégés, and all the others who look up to her for inspiration. What goes wrong when memory tragically fails? Laureate John Hardy explained beautifully the pathogenesis of Alzheimer's, and laureate Peter St. George-Hyslop took us on a grand historical tour of its genetic components. Indeed, Alzheimer's is a most dreadful illness to succumb to. We're honored to have had such unique and original researchers in our midst this week. May their work move forward in leaps and bounds to help quash this most debilitating and demeaning and distressing disease of advancing age. Whence, from here, laureate Marvin Minsky has taken us on a tour de force of the future. It's 101 years since the birth of that great young Brit, Alan Turing, one of the forefathers of computer science in general and founder of artificial science in particular. In addition, as Natan said, his major contribution to the shortening of World War II. It's only fitting that we've just heard from a founder of the Media Lab at MIT whose manifold contributions to the field, whose acute vision and keen, albeit human intelligence, have brought us that much closer to what once seemed wholly futuristic. On the subject of memory, rumor has it that as a child, Minsky dropped a dollar bill. Seeing someone pick it up, he jumped and claimed, "Oh, that's mine. How do I know it's yours?" To which Minsky responded by rattling off the bill's serial number, having memorized it inadvertently. Let me add that I and many others have been struck over the past few days by the wonderful and generous personalities of the Dun David laureates. They're not just wholly admirable for their groundbreaking research that has changed the way science understands mind and memory, but also each and every one is plainly a wonderful human being who cares about that which makes us human and humane. It's not mere accident that they've reached the heights they have and for which they've been honored this week. Now, the moment you've been waiting for. Before we close the day, I ask Ms. Smadar Fisher to come up, of the Dun David office, to come up and choose the winning poster and award the Mind and Memory Poster Prize. Okay. Is Anna Maleshkovich. Is Anna here? Well, moving on.
Moving on. Of course.
Yotam Menuchin. Menuchin.
Yotam?
Oh, it's getting exciting.
Yeah,
okay.
Sorry.
Tal Iram, I think.
Tal Iram, can you use Tal Iram? Tal? Okay, no one.
Okay.
We announced
this is random. There's a Noga Oren, our student. Okay.
Hina, Noga Oren is here. Aha!
There. Congratulations. Allow me to close with another somewhat... until she gets here.
Noga?
Noga.
Noga.
Yes, it's salam. Wow. Yes, the prize is a robot-driven, hovering something or other that can stay in the air for half an hour. Thank you. Congratulations. Let me just close with another somewhat apocryphal story. It's told in the halls of MIT that once upon a time, when the well-known computer scientist Jerry Sussman was still a novice, Marvin Minsky happened upon him as he sat hacking at the AI Lab's PDP-6, one of the very first commercial digital computers, a total of 23 of which of these newfangled machines were ever sold. "What are you doing?" asked Minsky. "I'm training a randomly wired neural network to play tic-tac-toe," replied Sussman. "Why is the net wired randomly?" asked Minsky. "Oh, I don't want it to have any preconceptions of how to play." Minsky then shut his eyes. "Why did you close your eyes?" Sussman asked his teacher. "Oh, so that the room will be empty," was the reply. At that moment, Sussman was enlightened. The annual Dan David Prize affords Tel Aviv University a unique opportunity to benefit from the wisdom of the world's greatest scholars and scientists. For today's most successful event, our heartfelt thanks go to the Dan David laureates, Professors John Hardy, Peter St. George-Hyslop, Brenda Milner, and Marvin Minsky, to the local speakers, Danny Michaelson, Segev Barak, Yael Chanin, Lior Wolf, and Natan Intrator. To Mr. Dan David's family, the Dan David Foundation, its prize committees, the Dan David team, the British Embassy staff, the University Administration, the Vice President for R&D, Yoav, the Sagol School of Neuroscience, the Blavatnik School of Computer Science, and last, but far from least, you, the distinguished audience. To all our guests, we wish you a most delightful stay here. And to everyone, we wish shalom, shalom, peace, peace, peace with one's neighbors, peace with the environment, peace of mind, and peace of spirit. Thank you all very much.